The man who abused me wasn't a stranger. It was the one I called brother. For 70 years. I buried this truth beneath dusty memories and polite smiles, telling myself no one would believe an old woman's story. But now, with my voice still steady and my heart still aching, I'm ready to speak. My name is Lillian May Cartwright. I'm 86 years old, and I live in Tulsa, Oklahoma. But once, a long time ago, I was just a teenage bride on a quiet farm with nowhere to run. This story is not easy to tell, but if you've ever carried a burden in silence, please stay with me. You are not alone. I was just 17 when I married James Cartwright. He was tall, with strong hands and a quiet smile that gave me a sense of safety. We married in the small Baptist church in Elmore, Oklahoma, with only my mother and his folks in attendance. I wore a borrowed dress and carried daisies from the edge of our yard. After the ceremony, I packed what little I had into a small suitcase and rode with James to his family's farm on the outskirts of town. The sun beat down on the dry fields, and I remember thinking, this land looks like it's holding its breath. James's family home was a plain, weather-worn house that smelled of tobacco and linseed oil. Inside, his parents kept mostly to themselves. The only other presence in that house was Calvin, James's younger brother. He was a wiry man with deep-set eyes and a way of speaking in half sentences. At first, I thought he was just shy. But even in those early days, something about him made me uneasy. He'd look at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, his gaze lingering longer than a brother-in-law's should. He never smiled. And when he did, it didn't reach his eyes. I did what I was taught to do. I cooked. I cleaned. I followed James's lead. Life on the farm was harsh and thankless. But I believed in duty, in holding a marriage together, in making a home where God placed you. James and I shared a small room in the back of the house, where nights were filled with the creaks of the windmill and the distant howls of prairie dogs. We talked about children, about saving up to move closer to town one day, about maybe building a place of our own. But dreams have a way of vanishing overnight. Just 3 months after we were married, James received a letter from the government. He was being drafted into the Korean War. I remember the way he folded the letter in his calloused hands, his mouth a hard line. That night, we lay in bed not speaking, just listening to the wind rattle the windows. 2 weeks later, I stood at the train station waving goodbye, a handkerchief pressed to my lips to hold back the sobs. With James gone, Calvin took on more responsibility around the house. He fixed fences, drove into town for supplies, and began assuming what he called the man's duties. But what unsettled me more than anything was the silence. Calvin didn't say much, but he watched. When I cooked in the kitchen, I'd feel his eyes on the back of my neck. When I scrubbed the floors, I'd hear the soft creak of a boot behind me. At night, I'd lie awake, heart pounding, waiting for the sound of his door opening down the hall. I told myself it was nothing, that I was being foolish, that the loneliness, the fear of James never coming back, was playing tricks on me. I called it my imagination, a word I clung to like a shield. I couldn't tell anyone. What would I say? That a man who hadn't even touched me had me jumping at shadows, that I felt unsafe in my own home because of looks. I wanted to be good, obedient, strong like my mother had been. So I told myself over and over again, you're safe, you're just tired, he's family. But the silence was just the beginning. The shift came slowly, like dusk bleeding into night. At first, it was small things. Calvin began commenting on what I wore. Don't wear that dress. He'd mutter, it's too tight, makes you look cheap. I'd look down at the same faded cotton dress I'd worn for 2 summers. Confused, it was James's favorite. One, he said, made me look like springtime, but I folded it away, replacing it with shapeless blouses and skirts that hung off me like drapes. He didn't stop there. Don't go into town without asking. He'd add, as though I were a child needing permission, don't talk to the mailman. He stares too much. I obeyed. out of caution, out of some strange hope that submission would calm the storm I felt brewing behind his eyes. Then came the first slap. It was a late afternoon in July. The air thick with heat and flies. I was in the back room hanging laundry when someone knocked at the front door. I didn't hear it at first, not over the rattle of the clothesline and the cicadas humming in the trees. Calvin stormed in, grabbed me by the arm, and struck me across the face. "You answer the door when someone knocks," he shouted. Spit flying, eyes wide with something unnameable. I stumbled backward, the world tilting sideways. My cheek burned. My heart thundered in my chest, but I said nothing. I told myself, he's grieving. James was his only brother. Maybe this is how some men mourn. Maybe the war had already taken something from both of us. I repeated that lie so many times it began to taste like truth. If I could explain his violence, maybe I wouldn't have to admit the terror it brought. But the house began to change around me. The windows once open to let in the breeze were suddenly nailed shut. The keys to the front and back doors disappeared. Calvin said it was for safety, but it felt more like a cage. He kept them in a drawer I wasn't allowed to touch. If I asked to visit my mother, he'd laugh. "You don't need her anymore. You're a Cartwright now." One morning, I sat at the kitchen table writing a letter to James. Just a few lines. Nothing about Calvin. Just, "I miss you. The days are long." When I stepped out to fetch water, Calvin walked in. When I returned, the letter was torn in half, fluttering to the floor like dead petals. "Don't write lies," he said coldly. "James doesn't need distractions. He needs to stay focused and alive." That night, I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that hums like static in your ears. Every creak of the old floorboards made my skin crawl. I started locking my bedroom door with a chair propped underneath the knob. My breaths became shorter, my shoulders curled inward. I moved through the house like a ghost, careful not to make noise, not to invite attention. I shrank inside my clothes, inside myself. I no longer prayed to be strong. I prayed not to be noticed. Fear crept into my bones like winter cold. Slowly, unrelentingly, it stiffened my spine, weakened my limbs, and the most terrifying part was how normal it started to feel, as if the silence, the control, the bruises that never quite healed, were just how life worked now. But fear has a way of numbing the soul before it shatters it. I kept writing letters to my mother. Even though I hadn't heard back in weeks, every few days, I'd carefully fold the pages, press them into envelopes, and leave them by the front door for Calvin to take into town. I didn't have a stamp or a way to mail them myself. "I'll handle it," he'd say, barely glancing at them, but the mailbox never brought a reply. No letter, no word, just silence, like I'd dropped my voice into a well too deep to echo back. It took time before I understood those letters were never sent, desperate for someone to talk to. I turned to Miss Bertha, one of the older ladies from the church who'd taken a liking to me when James and I first married. She came by once a month with leftover preserves and rhubarb pie, always wrapped in dish towels stitched with scriptures. I waited until Calvin left for supplies, then sat beside her on the porch steps. Trembling, I tried to speak, to tell her that something wasn't right, that the house felt colder when it should have been warm, that sometimes I felt watched. She blinked slowly, then reached for my hand and whispered, "You must pray harder. Child, the devil feeds on fear." And then she left. She never came again. The world shrank after that. Visitors stopped showing up. The neighbor who once brought eggs said nothing when we passed on the road. Later, I learned Calvin had told them I was sick, that I'd come down with something contagious, not right in the head. He'd shake his head solemnly, add that he didn't want to worry anyone, and it worked. People stopped knocking, stopped asking. I was disappearing without ever leaving. And then the way he looked at me changed. He'd sit too close during supper, not right beside me, but close enough to brush his leg against mine under the table. At first, I thought it was accidental. The kitchen was small. But then his hand would linger at the back of my chair longer than needed. He'd lean in to say something and let his breath hang on my cheek. I started pulling away so often that my body learned to flinch before my mind could even register it. Then came the night that still sits at the bottom of my spine. I woke in the dark. The wind outside hissing against the windows. Something in the room felt off. Heavy. My breath caught as I realized I wasn't alone. Calvin stood in the doorway. Not moving. Just watching. His silhouette still. Arms at his sides. Head tilted slightly like he was studying a painting. My heart thundered so loud I was sure he heard it. But he said nothing. After what felt like an hour. He turned and walked away. No explanation. No sound. The next morning, I dragged the old dresser in front of my door before I went to bed. I didn't sleep much, but it gave me something a sliver of control. When I woke the next day, the dresser was pushed aside, and the door, the little hook lock I'd screwed in with trembling hands, was gone. The holes where the screws had been were empty, like it had never existed. That's when I stopped pretending. That's when I knew he wasn't just a grieving man. He wasn't confused or lost. He was calculating, and he was preparing for something darker. The first time it happened, it was quiet. No shouting, no storm, just the clink of dishes being put away after supper, the sun fading behind the barn, and the air in the kitchen turning too still. I was rinsing the last plate when Calvin stood behind me, his shadow long across the counter. He said something I didn't quite hear. When I turned to ask what he meant, his hand struck me so hard across the face I dropped the plate. It shattered, just like the silence. I stumbled, and he shoved me hard into the pantry door. The wood caught my arm, tore the skin. I didn't cry out. I just looked at him, stunned, holding my arm where the blood had started to bead. Later that night, I sat in the bathtub, warm water blooming pink. The bruise on my cheek throbbed like a separate heartbeat, and the cut along my forearm stung against the soap. I remember staring at my reflection in the water, my face rippling and warped. "Please," I whispered into the steam, "don't let anyone ever see me like this." I thought of my mother, of James, of who I used to be just a year ago. The next morning, Calvin didn't mention it, but before he left to feed the cattle, he turned and said in a low voice, "Say a word." And James dies in Korea. Accidents happen to boys like him all the time. That was all it took. He knew exactly where to strike now without lifting a hand. Days passed, and then he came back. This time there was no slap. There was silence first. Always silence. I was folding laundry in the bedroom when I heard the door shut too gently. I turned and he was already there. What came next I will not describe. Not because I want to protect him, but because I need to protect myself. Some pain isn't made for retelling. And it didn't stop. It became routine. A sick, predictable rhythm that only I could hear. The sound of his boots outside the door. The click of the hallway light. The smell of tobacco and sweat. Sometimes it was worse than others. Sometimes it was over fast. But it always came. I stopped being a person in those moments. I became air. A wall. A ceiling. I'd count the cracks above the bed. The peeling paint on the windowsill. Anything to keep my mind away from what was being done to my body. I learned to leave myself behind when night fell. It was the only way I knew to survive. In the mornings, I would rise like a ghost, make eggs, sweep the floor, water the garden. My hands moved while my heart barely beat. I told myself over and over, just get to evening. If I could make it through one more day, maybe something would change. Maybe the letter from James would come. Maybe Calvin would leave. Maybe someone would notice. Maybe I'd just disappear. But something else started to stir in me. Not hope, not yet. But something else. Something deeper. A slow heat rising behind my ribs. The smallest flicker of rage. Like a coal beneath wet wood. I wasn't ready to call it by name, but it was there, waiting. It started with silence this time. Not his, but my body's. a silence where there had always been rhythm. My monthly cycle came and went like clockwork. Until one month. It didn't. I waited, told myself stress could delay it. I counted days, then weeks, but deep down, in the quiet parts of myself I no longer trusted. I already knew. I was pregnant, but I couldn't say it, not out loud, not even to myself at first. The thought came like a ghost in the night cold. Unreal. Terrifying. I felt it pressing at the edge of my awareness like a scream I couldn't let out. Every morning I woke up and put on my apron like always. But the world around me tilted. Nothing looked quite the same. The sky seemed too wide, the walls too close. I kept my eyes low, my hands busy. I didn't go to the clinic when the doctor made his monthly rounds in town. I couldn't bear to confirm what my bones already whispered. And as my belly grew, so did Calvin's violence. He sensed the shift in me. Even before it showed, he'd stare too long at my stomach, then lash out over nothing burned toast. A door left ajar. A towel hung wrong. He slapped harder, shoved harder. Once he dragged me outside by my hair and left me in the mud beside the chicken coop because I spoke too sharply. His cruelty turned paranoid. He began locking the food pantry, checking the phone lines, questioning every noise in the night, like the devil himself was at the door. I remember sitting on the cold floor one night, back against the stove, knees tucked to my chest, and thinking maybe dying would be easier than this. Maybe I could slip into the darkness quietly. Like a breath on the wind, no one would miss me. Not really. Not the girl I used to be. Now hollowed out like the fields in drought. But then I placed my hands on my belly, and something fluttered barely there. Like a soft turning leaf inside me, my breath caught. It wasn't just me anymore. There was life, fragile, dependent, real. It wasn't Calvin's child, not in my mind, not in my heart. It was mine, and that thought mine shifted everything. I began to whisper to the bump beneath my apron. You will not grow up in fear. You will never feel small. You will never wonder if you deserve love. I sang lullabies to the growing life inside me, the same ones Mama used to hum when brushing my hair. I traced little shapes on my skin where I imagined fingers and toes would be. In the dark, I told stories about stars and open fields and safety. I decided, then and there, if I survive this, they will never suffer like I did. That seed, both literal and emotional, took root in me. It became the reason I stood back up after every blow. The reason I wiped blood from my lip and still made dinner. The reason I didn't run headfirst into the night. I couldn't leave, not yet. I had to endure. At least long enough to find a way out. For both of us. And just when I thought I was utterly alone in this world, unseen and forgotten, someone saw. The knock came just after noon. Sharp and sudden against the front door. My heart leapt into my throat, as it always did with unexpected sounds. I wiped my hands on my apron and made my way to the door, slow and wary. When I opened it, there stood Ruth Hannigan, a neighbor from 3 farms over. She was older, maybe in her 50s, with grey-streaked hair, pulled tight in a bun, and a kindness that always felt steady, like the sun in a winter sky. I brought some blackberry preserves, she said, lifting a jar wrapped in a dish towel. Too much for just me. Thought you might want some. I managed a nod and a small smile. Stepping aside, thank you kindly. Ma'am, she handed the jar to me, but didn't turn to go. Her eyes rested on my collarbone, on the faint purplish bruise barely hidden by my blouse. I shifted, pulling the fabric up, hoping to mask what she saw, but Ruth didn't comment. She just said, gently, you look tired. Honey, you take care. Now, then she left, walking down the dusty road like nothing had happened. That night, just as the sun was sinking, I heard another knock. This time, Ruth didn't have preserves in her hand. She stepped inside quickly, her eyes darting toward the back hallway, as if she feared Calvin might appear. She carried a brown paper envelope and a small clutch purse. Without preamble, she whispered, listen to me. Child, You don't owe me an explanation. But I see what's happening here, and I can't sit quiet no more. I opened my mouth, but no words came. My throat closed around the thousand things I wanted to say, how long it had been, how scared I was, how helpless I felt. But Ruth filled the silence. I've written down an address in Tulsa, she said, slipping a folded paper into my hand. It's a home for women. Quiet. Safe. They don't ask too many questions. You show up. They'll take you in. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a train ticket, folded lengthwise with the time and date written in ink. There's a train out of Norman in 3 days. I'll drive you myself. I stared at the items in my palm like they weren't real. I can't. I whispered, if he finds out. Ruth leaned in, her voice low and fierce. If he finds out, he'll kill you one day. Or worse, he'll raise that baby like it's his to mold. You think he won't? I blinked back tears, my body trembling like a tree in a storm. He's not your family. That baby is. You hear me? Ruth's voice softened. The baby deserves more than your silence. I felt something shift in me, some ancient ache, some dam that had held too long. For a moment, I let myself imagine it. A town where no one knew my name, a room with a lock on the door, a child that would grow up unafraid of every creak in the floorboard. That night, for the first time in months, I let myself close my eyes and not listen for footsteps. I let myself fall asleep, holding that paper in my hand, and in the hush before dawn, I dreamed not of pain, not of escape, but of freedom, a soft breeze through an open window, laughter not born from madness, a life where I wasn't always looking over my shoulder. The moonlight cast long silver lines across the kitchen floor as I stood there, frozen, holding my breath. My hand shook as I reached for the canvas satchel I had hidden behind the pantry. Inside, I placed one faded dress, a hairbrush, the folded paper with the Tulsa address, and the train ticket Ruth had given me. That was all I had, along with a fear so deep it made my bones ache. Every movement felt loud in that sleeping house. I avoided the squeaky board near the stove. I didn't dare light a lamp. The only sound was the faint hiss of wind through the gaps in the window panes and the soft clink of glass from the next room. Calvin was passed out on the parlor couch. The bottle lay on his chest like a dead thing. His hand slack, his breath thick and heavy with liquor. I paused in the doorway and stared at him. For a moment, I imagined picking up the bottle and smashing it across his face, but I had no room for vengeance, only escape. I slipped through the back door, careful not to let it creak. The air was sharp against my skin. Oklahoma spring still carried winter's chill at night. I didn't wear shoes. I couldn't risk the sound. Each step across the gravel bit into my feet. But I didn't stop. I told myself pain is proof I'm still alive. The road to the station was 6 miles of darkness. No lanterns. No signs, just memory and prayer. I kept to the side, ducking low when the rare headlights appeared in the distance. My heart pounded with every rustle in the grass, every snap of a twig. I imagined Calvin rising behind me, shouting my name, grabbing my wrist. I imagined the weight of his hand at the back of my neck, but nothing came, just wind, just stars. Somewhere near mile 4, my legs began to tremble. I stopped behind a barbed wire fence and crouched. Holding my belly, I whispered to it soft things, trembling things. We're going far. Mama's going to keep you safe. The words barely made it out of my dry mouth. But they were real, more real than anything else that night. When the train station lights finally came into view, I sobbed, not loud, not wailing, just a long, silent release, like breath escaping a sealed jar. I stepped inside the waiting room and found a bench at the far corner. The man behind the ticket window didn't look at me twice. I was just another girl traveling alone. Just another shadow slipping out of a small town in the middle of the night. I boarded the train when the whistle blew, gripping the metal rail like it was the only thing tethering me to earth. I sat by the window, pressing my hand against the glass. Feeling the cold seep into my skin, the engine groaned, the wheels clanked, and we moved. As the train pulled away, I looked back once. The town disappeared fast in the distance, the old grain silo, the crooked water tower, the lights of the farmhouses I'd passed barefoot in the dark. My old life grew smaller and smaller until it was nothing but memory. I laid my hand over my belly and whispered, "It's over. Not everything. Of course, not the fear, not the ache in my feet or the bruises still hidden beneath my dress, but that house, that man, that silence, that part was over. And even if I didn't know what was waiting in Tulsa, I knew what I was leaving behind. That night, I became someone else. Not a wife, not a victim, a mother, a fighter, a girl who ran barefoot in the dark and never stopped walking. Tulsa didn't welcome me with open arms, but it didn't question me either, and that was enough. I arrived with nothing but a name that no longer belonged to me, and a life I could no longer bear to claim. So I left Lillian May Cartwright behind in the dust of that back road and became Margaret Fields. It was the name Ruth had scribbled on the ticket envelope, the one she said would keep me safe. In a boarding house on the north side of town, I rented a room the size of a closet with a shared bathroom down the hall. The walls were thin, and the city sounds never stopped. But it was freedom, real freedom. I could breathe without fear. I could sleep without the sound of boots pacing the hallway. 3 weeks after I arrived, my labor began. I had no one beside me in that birthing room. Just a nurse with kind eyes and the ghost of Ruth's words repeating in my head, "The baby deserves more than your silence." When they handed her to me, her skin flushed and her fist trembling against the light, I wept harder than I thought possible. I named her Hope, because that's what she was not, just my reason to run. But the reason I kept walking. She looked nothing like Calvin. And for that, I thanked whatever mercy watched over me. The days were long and unforgiving. I took work as a seamstress at a dry cleaner's downtown. The pay barely covered milk and rent. But I learned to mend not just fabric, but myself. Each stitch steadied my hands. Each button sewn back on was a promise that I could build something that lasted. At the laundromat, I met other women who didn't flinch at shadows or shrink when men raised their voices. One had run from her father, another from a husband. One just said she had left a place that broke her. We shared nothing and everything all at once. At first, I just listened. But in time, I spoke, in hushed tones, over baskets of unfolded clothes or while holding our babies in the park. I told them pieces of what I had seen, of what I had survived, and one by one, they told their stories. Too, the shame unraveled, the silence cracked open. Years passed. I saved enough to buy a small machine and take on extra sewing from home. Hope grew tall and stubborn. With eyes like summer wheat, she asked questions I wasn't always ready to answer, but I never lied. I just told her when the time was right. I would share everything. I began volunteering at a shelter just once a week at first. Then more. I found my voice in that place. I became the woman sitting quietly beside another, waiting for her to say, "I'm ready." I told my story to help them find their own, because there's power in being believed. There's healing in being heard, and sometimes the very act of saying, "I survived," is enough to keep someone else going. I never stopped missing my old name, but I stopped missing the girl I used to be. She needed saving, and now I was the one who could save someone else. And now, I finally have the strength to tell you this story. From my porch in Tulsa, the wind still carries a certain sound, dry and restless, like it remembers, some evenings, when the sun leans low against the rooftops and the shadows stretch long across my garden. I close my eyes and I'm back there, back on that lonely farm in Oklahoma, where the silence screamed louder than words. I am 86 years old now. My hands tremble when I pour my tea, and the stairs creak more beneath my weight. But these hands, they still remember the first time I held my daughter, the way she fit against my chest, warm and tiny, her breath whispering the word, beginning into my broken ribs. I made it. Not perfectly, not without scars, but I made it. Pain, I've learned, does not always leave the body. Sometimes it hides in the bones, in the dreams, in the questions no one asks. But hope is quieter and braver. It waits until you are ready. And when you are, it walks beside you, never ahead. If you're listening to this and still living in fear, yes, you please hear me. You are not invisible. You are not to blame. What happened to you is not your fault. You don't need to shout. A whisper is enough. A whisper is a beginning. Don't let silence write your story. If this story found a place in your heart, let it move through you. Let it reach someone else who might still be trapped, thinking there's no way out. Share it. Comment below. Subscribe. Not for me, but for the ones still waiting to be seen. Let's turn these buried secrets into light.